The last night Robert Langley was seen alive began like any other evening in the quiet suburb of Maple Hollow, Illinois. It was the spring of 1993. The air still cool enough that the smell of rain clung to the lawns, and porch lights flickered on one by one as families settled in for the night. The Langley home sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, 2 stories of red brick and white shutters. The kind of house where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. Robert, 45, was the sort of man neighbors trusted immediately, a high school history teacher. He had the patience of someone used to long essays and slow learners. In his free time, he built furniture, fixed leaky faucets, and helped elderly neighbors with their fences. His students described him as the teacher who made you care about the past, the kind who remembered every birthday and could fix a broken desk leg with a smile. His wife, and managed the local library, quiet, composed, with a warmth that made people linger at the checkout counter. Their daughter, Clara, 10, had inherited Robert's curiosity, always asking how things worked. Their son, Matthew, 7, was mischievous and full of energy, the kind of boy who left fingerprints on freshly cleaned glass. Together, they were ordinary in the best sense. A family whose days were stitched together by school runs, Sunday pancakes, and shared laughter echoing down the hall. That spring, Robert had taken on a project, converting the unfinished basement into a playroom for the kids. He worked on it every evening after dinner, hands dusted with sawdust, humming along to old records while and read upstairs. The space smelled of varnish and pine. He had installed new shelves, built a small wooden desk for Clara, and promised Matthew a hidden secret corner behind one wall for his toy soldiers. "Just wait till it's done," he'd say, smiling. "It'll be our little world under the world." On April 6, 1993, nothing seemed out of place. They ate chicken stew at the kitchen table, talked about Matthew's upcoming soccer game, and laughed when Clara showed her father a drawing she'd made of their family, all holding hands beside a smiling house. After dinner, Robert kissed both children goodnight, helped and load the dishwasher, and told her he'd go finish up the molding before it got too late. He took a thermos of coffee and disappeared down the narrow staircase that led to the basement workshop. It was 9:15 p.m. when and last heard the hum of his small radio drifting up through the vent. At 10 o'clock, she passed by the door and called down. "Don't stay up too late," he called back. "Just one more hour." His voice sounded calm, ordinary, the last ordinary moment of their lives. By morning, the house was unervingly still. The radio downstairs was silent. The smell of coffee lingered faintly, mixed with sawdust, and assumed Robert had already left for work. Until she noticed his car still in the garage. She frowned. Checking the kitchen table, his briefcase sat open. Lesson plans inside. Upstairs, the children were still asleep, their father's usual whistle missing from the hallway. When she went downstairs to the basement, the air felt oddly heavy, colder than the rest of the house. The workshop light was on. Robert's tools were laid out neatly on the bench. Screwdriver, hammer, measuring tape, each in its proper place. The half-finished wooden molding rested beside them. Sawdust swept into a tidy pile. His wallet and car keys sat on the counter, next to a coffee cup that had gone cold. "Robert," she called softly. Her voice bounced back off the walls. She checked the furnace room, then the small storage area by the stairs. Empty. No sound but the faint tick of the basement clock. The door that led outside was locked from the inside. By 10:30 a.m., panic set in and called the school. He hadn't shown up for his morning class. His colleagues hadn't heard from him. No phone calls. No messages. She called the police by noon. The responding officers searched every inch of the house. They checked windows, crawl spaces, and the yard. There was no sign of forced entry. No footprints in the garden soil. One of the officers, a young recruit named Tom Avery, brought an AK-9 unit. The dogs sniffed Robert's clothing, then circled the rooms. They followed the scent trail through the hallway, down the stairs, and stopped at the basement door. The handler urged them on, but they refused, whining softly and pacing. When the door was opened, they descended a few steps, circled once, and then sat down, silent. The scent, they signaled, ended there. Reporters arrived within hours. Father vanishes without a trace. The headlines would later read, neighbors gathered on lawns, whispering theories, heart attack, midlife crisis. Abduction, none made sense. If he had collapsed somewhere, his body would have been found. If he had left, why were his car, wallet, and keys untouched? The basement showed no sign of struggle, no sign of anyone else entering or leaving. It was as if the man had stepped out of his life like a ghost, leaving no shadow behind. And his face appeared on the evening news. Eyes red, but voice steady. "Robert would never leave us," she said. "He's here somewhere. He has to be." Behind her, police moved through the house methodically, snapping photos, taking plaster casts of footprints that weren't there. By the second night, volunteers joined the search. They combed through nearby woods, drained a retention pond, even searched inside abandoned sheds. Nothing. The only detail that seemed to haunt the officers was how immaculate Robert's workspace had been. His tools wiped clean, the sawdust neatly swept, the workbench perfectly arranged, almost like he knew someone would be coming to look. One investigator remarked quietly. Days turned to weeks. The story spread statewide. The man who vanished indoors. Psychics offered theories. Amateur sleuths mailed letters. But the evidence remained what it had been that first morning. A cup of cold coffee, a locked basement, and silence. And kept the light on in the basement for months afterward, convinced he might somehow find his way back. She couldn't bring herself to box up his tools or finish the playroom he had started. The space remained exactly as he'd left it, frozen in the moment between one breath and the next. Detectives came and went, every few years reopening the file. Each time, they reached the same conclusion. Robert Langley had disappeared without ever stepping outside. For the first few months after Robert Langley's disappearance, the town of Maple Hollow lived in a state of disbelief. It didn't feel like a crime story. It felt like a mistake waiting to be corrected. People expected to see him walking out of the woods, covered in dust, sheepishly apologizing for causing a fuss. But as spring faded into summer and the flyers on telephone poles began to curl from the heat, disbelief turned into something heavier, resignation. Search teams combed every corner of the surrounding land. Police expanded the radius mile by mile, searching lakes, drainage ditches, and wooded trails. The fire department brought in divers to drag the nearby quarry, while volunteers beat through brush shoulder to shoulder, calling Robert's name until their voices cracked. Nothing surfaced. No torn clothing, no shoe prints, no sign he had ever left the property. The local newspaper chronicled the efforts in neat columns. Day 12. Search continues for missing teacher. Day 28. Police seek new leads. By day 60, the updates stopped. The story had grown too strange for daily coverage and too cold for headlines. Detectives interviewed, and repeatedly, they asked the same questions in slightly different ways. Had they argued that night? Was Robert under stress? Did he have any debts, secrets, other lives? Each time, and answered calmly, but the doubt in their eyes deepened. Rumors spread through the neighborhood like static. Some said Robert had staged his own disappearance. Others whispered about domestic conflict, insurance money, or a hidden affair. None of it matched the man anyone knew. But rumor has its own gravity, and it pulled the story deeper into shadow and tried to hold her family together. For months, she kept the house exactly as it had been. Robert's shoes by the door, his jacket on the hook, his cup still in the sink. At night, when the children slept, she sat on the basement steps, staring at the empty workbench. The silence there wasn't peaceful. It was a hum that pressed against her ears. Sometimes she swore she could smell sawdust again, or hear a faint knock, as if someone were working behind the wall. But when she stood, it vanished. The police eventually closed the case as an unsolved disappearance, without a body. They couldn't declare him dead, without evidence. They couldn't call it a crime. He became what one reporter labeled, almost poetically, the man who vanished indoors. A year later, and sold the house. She couldn't stay. Every hallway felt like an unfinished sentence. She packed the children's toys, boxed up photo albums, and left Robert's tools behind. The new owners, a young couple named Harris, moved in quietly, repainting walls and replacing carpets. But the basement, they said, always felt off. Their dog refused to go down the stairs. Light bulbs burned out faster than anywhere else in the house. After 2 years, they moved away. Then another family tried. Then another. None stayed longer than 3 by the late 90s. The property had a new name among locals, the Langley House. Realtors stopped correcting people when they asked, "Oh, that one?" The place where the teacher disappeared. Children on bicycles dared each other to knock on the door, claiming they heard faint hammering beneath the floorboards when they stood on the porch. Online forums began to appear in the 2000s. Small digital corners where strangers gathered to trade mysteries. Someone posted an old clipping from the Maple Hollow Gazette under the title, "Teacher Vanishes in Basement." Within months, it had dozens of replies. Amateur sleuths dissected the floor plan, proposed theories about secret tunnels, temporal anomalies, or hypnosis experiments. One post called it the basement vanishing, and the name stuck. Every few years, a new wave of interest revived the case. True crime blogs listed it among 10 most baffling missing person mysteries. Podcast hosts revisited it on anniversaries. Photos of the house circulated online, most taken by curious travelers standing at the end of the cul-de-sac. The camera tilted toward a second-floor window where, rumor claimed, a shadow sometimes moved when the house was empty. Meanwhile, life moved forward for the Langley family, but not evenly. Clara, who had been 10 the night her father vanished, grew up carrying the absence like a second name. In school, she introduced herself simply as Clara Langley. Yes, that Langley. She hated the curiosity it sparked, but could never escape it. Every history project, every essay she wrote came back to missing people, lost letters, forgotten stories. As an adult, she joined online missing person networks, reading case files deep into the night. The logic of it, the patterns, the small details others missed, gave her a sense of control she'd never felt as a child. But the Langley file was different. No matter how many times she reopened it, the evidence refused to make sense. How could a man disappear inside his own home? She visited the old neighborhood once in her 20s, parking across from their former house. The siding had been replaced, the shutters painted gray, but the shape was the same. Through the basement window, she could see a faint light left on, a single bulb swaying slightly. Though there was no wind, she sat there for almost an hour before driving away, heart pounding, whispering, "Dad, if you're there, just show me something." Nothing moved, and, now aging quietly in a smaller home, avoided the topic. "We have to live in the present," she'd say whenever Clara brought it up. But Matthew, who barely remembered his father, sometimes dreamt of the sound of hammering, rhythmic, distant, muffled by walls. He'd wake certain that someone had been working just below his room. Decades blurred the sharp edges of the tragedy. Time softened the suspicion, replaced it with legend. Teenagers told stories about the man who built his own tomb, about a haunted workshop echoing under the foundation. Some claimed to see light under the cracks of the basement door. Even when the house was vacant, in 2020, the property was sold once more, this time to an older couple who intended to remodel it from the ground up. They said they didn't believe in ghosts. They believed in good resale value. For 2 years, the renovation stalled due to permits and budgets. The basement remained untouched, sealed behind a wooden door that creaked whenever the weather changed. Then, in the spring of 2023, a new crew arrived, a team of contractors hired to finally finish the lower floor. On a quiet afternoon in March, one of them, a man named Alex Romero, swung his hammer to remove the old floorboards. The first strike echoed deeper than expected, a hollow thud that didn't sound like wood hitting concrete. He frowned, knelt, and tapped again. The same hollow sound answered back. The others paused their work. Alex smiled nervously. "Guess we found your crawl space," he joked, but when he pried up the next plank, A rush of cold air drifted out, air that smelled of dust and metal and something faintly sweet, like wood long sealed away. That sound, the hammer striking hollow wood, was the moment everything changed. 30 years later, the house would speak again, through the sound of a hammer striking hollow wood. By the spring of 2023, the house on Maple Hollow Lane had long since stopped being a home and become an investment. The new owners, Liam and Nora Fisher, were a young couple in their early 30s. Both teachers, both dreamers, who believed that what others called bad luck was just an opportunity waiting for elbow grease. The Langley house, with its sunken basement and worn shutters, was the biggest gamble of their lives. The day the renovation crew arrived, the neighborhood was quiet except for the thrum of a cement mixer 2 streets over. The workers moved through each floor methodically, tearing down paneling, replacing wiring, modernizing the kitchen. When they finally reached the basement, the air grew still. It was colder down there, with a lingering smell of varnish and dust that hadn't lifted in decades. In one corner stood a workbench, sagging slightly under its own weight, the same one that had belonged to Robert Langley. The foreman, Alex Romero, tapped his boot against the concrete and frowned. "Feels uneven," he muttered. The others agreed. The flooring, aged plywood over old joists, sounded hollow in patches. They chalked it up to rot, the usual in houses this old, and marked it for replacement. But when Alex returned a few days later with fresh lumber, he noticed something peculiar. The hollow sound wasn't consistent. Only a square section, about 4 feet by 3, gave that distinct, empty echo. "Let's pull this up carefully," he told his crew. He swung his hammer once. The same sound that had echoed faintly through the house weeks earlier when they began demolition. The planks splintered easily, revealing another layer beneath, a sheet of plywood sealed with dozens of nails. The edges were lined with hardened glue, as though someone had gone to great effort to keep it airtight. Curiosity turned the workday into an impromptu excavation. They pried up the plywood, coughing as a cloud of stale dust billowed upward. Beneath it lay a narrow crawl space, barely large enough for a grown man to fit through, lined with old insulation and scrap wood. The flashlight beam caught something metallic at the far end. Alex reached down with a gloved hand and pulled. It came free with a groan of rusted hinges. A metal box, about the size of a toolbox, wrapped in layers of insulation and bound by wire. Probably just old wiring junk, one worker guessed. But the moment Alex laid it on the floor, everyone felt the weight of something different. He brushed off the dust and saw faint lettering etched into the lid. R. Langley. They called the homeowners. Liam and Nora arrived within minutes. Breathless, their excitement mingled with unease. They filmed the process on a phone, joking nervously about a time capsule. Alex unwrapped the box, and the insulation peeled away in flakes. Inside, everything was carefully arranged. Photographs, folded letters, a wristwatch with a cracked face, and a small cassette tape. The air smelled faintly of oil and old paper. The first photograph showed Robert Langley standing at his workbench, smiling faintly, his sleeves rolled up. The second was more haunting. He stood in the same basement, but this time beside a freshly painted wall, the brush still wet in his hand. Behind him, faint outlines of what looked like a seam or indentation ran across the concrete. The letters were addressed to "My family." The handwriting was unmistakably his. Neat, careful, almost academic. Most were sealed, yellowed with age, the ink faint. Nora held one up to the light and read the first line aloud. "If you're reading this, then I never made it back upstairs." She stopped there. Her hands shook as she passed it to Liam. The discovery made local news that same afternoon. Within hours, police cars lined the street again for the first time in 30 years. Detective Paul Hensley, now heading the cold case division, arrived at the scene. "Don't touch anything else," he instructed. The box was sealed and transferred to the evidence lab. The house, once again, became a crime scene. Forensic teams swept through the basement, using ultraviolet light. They examined the area around the removed planks, What they found silenced the room. Beneath the layers of wood and sealant, in the cracks between joists, were faint traces of organic residue, small, dark flecks that looked like dust but tested positive for human DNA. Samples were taken immediately, under the spot where the box had been found. A section of flooring appeared newer, though it's slightly different in grain and color from the rest. Technicians scraped away a portion of paint near the base of the wall. Beneath it, hidden by years of overcoating, they uncovered a small handwritten marking. The initials are L, followed by the date April 6, 93. The night Robert vanished, the news spread fast. Reporters stood outside the house as though waiting for the ghost of Robert Langley to reappear. Headlines read, "The basement vanishing reopened after 30 years." Neighbors gathered on lawns, whispering. Many of them had grown up hearing stories about the house, but never believed them until now. The recovered items were cataloged meticulously. The wristwatch, stopped permanently at 9:47 p.m., was the same model and Langley once mentioned in her police interview. Robert's anniversary gift, the photographs were developed Polaroids, meaning they were taken just days before his disappearance. The letters were too fragile to unfold immediately. They would be restored by specialists later, but the cassette tape drew the most attention. It was an old Memorex audio cassette, labeled simply Workshop, despite its age. The tape reel inside appeared intact. "It might still play," said one forensic technician. The sound lab prepared to digitize it under controlled conditions, fearing it would crumble under a normal recorder. That evening, Detective Hensley met with Clara Langley, now 40, who had flown in from Michigan the moment she heard. She stood in the same basement where her father had vanished, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "He was here the whole time," she whispered, voice breaking. "All these years, and he was just here." The next morning, the forensic team finalized their test. The organic samples beneath the boards contained two distinct genetic profiles. One matched Robert Langley, the other remained unidentified. The information was classified immediately, pending deeper analysis. Hensley said only, "We're closer to the truth than we've ever been." That night, the tape was played for the first time in a soundproof lab. As the audio crackled to life, the team heard the faint hum of the basement's old ventilation fan, the scrape of wood, and the sound of Robert's breathing. His voice followed, calm, steady, but edged with exhaustion. "This is Robert Langley," he began. "If anyone finds this, there's something in this house I need to explain." The room fell silent. The voice of the man who had vanished 30 years earlier filled the air once more, his words rising from beneath layers of dust and time. And on the tape, Robert's voice began to tell a story no one was prepared to hear. The first words on the tape were quiet, almost hesitant, as though Robert Langley had been afraid even to record them. "This is Robert," his voice said through the static. "If you're hearing this, I don't know what you'll think, but there's something down here, something in this house that was never meant to be found." He sounded tired, breath heavy, like a man who had gone too long without sleep. The faint hum of the basement's ventilation fan underscored every sentence. "When I started the renovation," he continued, "I thought I was just building a playroom for the kids, but when I took down the old paneling near the foundation, I found a seam in the concrete, like a line where the wall had been patched from the inside. Behind it, I heard air moving, and then the tape cracked with static before his voice returned. Sharper now, a hollow space, a room that wasn't supposed to exist." The forensic technicians exchanged uneasy glances as the recording played. Hensley leaned closer to the speaker, brow furrowed. Robert's breathing quickened. "I thought it was just structural," he said. "Old houses settle, they shift, right?" But then I heard another pause, a long silence broken only by a faint tap tap tap, rhythmic, distant, echoing through the tape. "Whispers," Robert finally said, "at night, through the vents, like someone was talking beneath the floor." He spoke of finding objects sealed inside the wall. A rusted pocket knife, a broken belt buckle, a photograph too faded to make out. They'd been encased in concrete, left by whoever had lived there before the Langleys. I thought it was nonsense, he said, old junk buried during a remodel. But the more I listened, the more I realized the sounds were coming from behind that wall. He laughed nervously on the recording, a brittle, frightened sound. I started digging at night after the kids went to bed. I couldn't help it. I needed to know. I measured every inch of the foundation. But the blueprints didn't match. There was an extra space, about 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, hidden between the furnace room and the outer wall. At this point in the investigation, Detective Hensley ordered the forensic team back to the Langley house. If a chamber existed, they would find it. Using thermal imaging and ground-penetrating radar, they scanned the wall Robert had described. The readings came back irregular, dense concrete punctuated by a pocket of empty space. When technicians drilled a small borehole and inserted a camera, the feed flickered into view, a dark cavity, the lens catching a glimpse of crumbling stone and something pale on the floor. Excavation began immediately. Workers broke through the wall, revealing a narrow chamber, the air stale and heavy. Inside lay fragments of old furniture, a rusted tin cup, and the remains of a man's skeleton, partially collapsed against the wall. His clothes were rotted away, the fabric style dating back decades before the Langleys had bought the home. The bones showed signs of trauma, fractured ribs, a shattered wrist. The coroner estimated he'd been dead for at least 40 years. When the lab cleaned the chamber, they discovered faint writing scratched into the concrete with something sharp. One phrase appeared again and again, uneven and erratic. He watches from under the floor. The revelation spread through the press like wildfire. Headlines screamed, "Skeleton found in basement," where father vanished. Reporters swarmed Maple Hollow once again. For the first time, there was proof that Robert Langley had been right. Something was inside his house. Meanwhile, the tape continued to unravel its story. "I don't think I'm alone down here," Robert said on the recording. "Last night, I filled the gap with cement, sealed it, but when I came down this morning, there were new cracks. The air feels different, like someone's still breathing behind it." He mentioned finding a diary, hidden in the crawl space under the furnace, belonging to a previous owner named Harold Moffat. The name matched property records from the 1950s. A man who had fled Chicago after a string of thefts and was never apprehended. In the diary's final pages, Moffat wrote about the man who came before me and his attempts to silence the watcher under the floor. The writing grew frantic toward the end, with repeated phrases, "He doesn't die. He waits when you sleep." As Hensley read the transcriptions aloud, the forensic team cross-referenced Moffat's details. Records confirmed he had indeed owned the property in 1957 and had disappeared only 2 years later. The skeleton's estimated age and era fit. They believed they had found Moffat's remains, but one mystery replaced another. The DNA tests from the earlier organic samples, taken under the floorboards, came back with 2 partial matches. One belonged to the skeleton, the other matched Robert Langley. That meant Robert's blood, or part of him, had ended up beneath the same boards that sealed the chamber. Detective Hensley returned to the tape, hoping it would explain. The final minutes were damaged. Warped from moisture, Robert's voice wavered, barely audible through the distortion. "I found his bones," he whispered. "He wasn't buried deep. I think he was trying to get out." His voice broke, trembling. "And if you hear this, don't let them open the wall again, I think." A sharp crack interrupted the tape, followed by scraping sounds, and then silence. The reel kept turning, but no more words came. Technicians cleaned and amplified the final seconds, revealing faint background noise. Beneath the static, something rhythmic could be heard. 2 taps, a pause. 2 taps again. The same pattern neighbors once claimed to hear through the house's floorboards. When investigators removed additional sections of the basement, they found a narrow vertical tunnel connected to the chamber, a crawl space Robert must have used while attempting to seal it. In that tunnel, embedded in hardened concrete, they discovered more biological traces, bone fragments too small to identify, but the DNA matched the earlier sample. Experts concluded that Robert had likely injured himself fatally. perhaps crushed or trapped, while pouring concrete into the chamber's opening. His own work entombing him where he stood. Clara was present when Hensley gave the results. She sat quietly, hands folded, staring at the floor. He was trying to fix something, she said finally. That's what he always did. Her words carried neither anger nor relief, only a weary understanding. The news cycle framed it as a tragic accident wrapped in folklore. But those who'd heard the tape couldn't shake the unease it left behind. In his final message, Robert's voice had changed, calmer, almost accepting. As he said, "If anyone finds this, don't open the floor again." He tried to seal away the secret he'd uncovered. And in doing so, he'd sealed himself. The father hadn't vanished at all. He had buried the truth, and himself, beneath his own home. For months after the revelation, the Langley house remained sealed behind yellow tape, its basement treated like a historical excavation site rather than a crime scene. The forensic teams came and went, the news vans drifted away, and Maple Hollow returned to its steady suburban rhythm. But everyone who lived nearby knew the silence beneath that foundation was not the same. Eventually, the property was purchased by the town council and declared a memorial site. The decision wasn't unanimous. Some residents wanted it demolished. Others wanted it forgotten. But in the end, the town agreed that too much of their history had vanished already. They couldn't erase another story, even one as unsettling as this. Contractors stabilized the walls, filled the sealed chamber with concrete, and covered the floor with a thick glass panel. Visitors could now stand over the exact spot where Robert had disappeared, peering down into the dim light beneath. The small display that followed was simple, respectful. A wooden plaque by the stairs read, "The Langley House, dedicated to Robert Langley, 1948 to 1993, and to those who seek truth, no matter the cost." Inside the foyer, a quiet exhibit lined the wall, echoes beneath the floor, behind protective glass. The recovered letters Robert had written to his family rested in their restored envelopes. Some were only fragments, water-stained and fragile, but enough words remained to show the shape of a father's love. "Tell the kids I'm proud," one read in fading ink. "I didn't mean to leave you scared. I just needed to understand what this house was trying to say." Beside the letters sat the wristwatch, its hands forever fixed at 9:47 p.m. and a small display speaker that looped the first 30 seconds of the cassette recording. Just Robert's voice introducing himself before the audio cut to static. The full version was archived by the state, restricted from public release. Only one person was ever permitted to hear it in its entirety again, his daughter, Clara, on a gray November morning, 30 years after the night he vanished, and returned to Maple Hollow with her grown children. Time had softened her face, but her eyes still carried that same quiet steadiness. The three of them stood outside the house, now painted a pale cream, the lawn neatly trimmed. Reporters were gone, and the crowd had long since lost interest. Only the wind moved across the trees and knelt near the foundation and laid a bouquet of white lilies against the concrete. Matthew placed a folded photo of their family, the four of them at the park, smiling. Clara stood back, silent, her hands trembling as she held a small digital recorder containing the cleaned version of her father's final tape. When she pressed play, Robert's voice filled the air between them. "This is Robert Langley," it began, faint and distant. The static crackled softly, then faded to silence. For nearly a minute, nothing else came. Then, just before the recording ended, a whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to pierce through 30 years of time. "Clara." Her name, spoken as if he were standing only a few feet away, and covered her mouth, tears breaking loose. Clara let the device play to the end. After the whisper came the faint creak of wood and a single tap, as if someone had gently knocked from beneath the floor. She didn't say anything afterward. She just stood, listening to the quiet hum of the old house settling into itself. For the next year, the Langley property became a strange pilgrimage point. People came not for horror, but for something subtler, the desire to stand where ordinary life had folded into mystery. Teachers brought their students, Journalists filmed documentaries. True crime enthusiasts left flowers and small wooden carvings, shaped like hammers, at night. The caretaker swore he could hear faint knocking sounds from beneath the floorboards, soft as breathing. It's just the foundation adjusting, engineers said, but he never worked there alone after sunset. Online, the case refused to fade. Forums buzzed with speculation. Some believed Robert had uncovered an ancient Prohibition-era tunnel system, collapsing it accidentally and trapping himself inside. Others argued it was a cover-up, that something more than one body had been sealed beneath the house. A smaller group insisted the whispers and tapping were evidence of residual energy, that the house itself was alive in some way. Remembering what it had witnessed, documentaries debated whether the diary of Harold Moffat was genuine or forged. One late-night radio host suggested the entire structure had been built atop an unmarked graveyard. Rational voices countered that Robert's death was tragic, but explainable. A man obsessed with fixing everything, trapped by the one thing he couldn't repair, his own curiosity. Still, no theory ever satisfied everyone. The only fact that remained undisputed was the one that still haunted the town. Robert never truly left his home. By 2025, the Langley house stood empty again, closed to visitors for safety inspections. But those who lived nearby continued to report small disturbances. Lights flickering in the basement, faint music like a radio turning on and off, tools rattling in the night. Once, a group of contractors hired to rewire the museum wing swore they heard a man's voice call from below, "Hold the beam steady." They left without finishing the job and passed away quietly 2 years later. At her funeral, Clara spoke softly to the crowd. "My father spent his life teaching history," she said. "I think, in the end, he became part of it." When the ceremony ended, she placed his letters beside her mother's coffin, binding the two stories together. As for the house, it remains, windows shuttered, foundation sealed, yet never truly still. The plaque outside tarnishes a little more each year, the letters darkening with rain and time. But sometimes, visitors claim that if you stand long enough in the basement and listen closely, the walls seem to exhale, a slow, steady breath, and if you tap the floor twice, you might hear 2 faint taps in return. Clara visits once every spring. She doesn't bring flowers anymore. She simply stands above the glass panel, looking down at the floor where her father once worked, where his story ended and hers began. She presses her hand to the cool surface and whispers, "It's finished now, Dad." The air always answers with a quiet creak, like old wood acknowledging her. Because some homes don't hold memories, they hold confessions waiting to be found.